Buenas tardes, bienvenidos a invitados especiales. Hoy tenemos al Dr. Lowry, quien es director del Programa de África y Madagascar en el Missouri Botanical Garden. Es un botánico con formación en sistemática de plantas y estudia la evolución y la clasificación de las plantas con flores, especialmente de la familia Araliaceae. El doctor Lowry nos va a hablar entonces del programa Jardín Botánico de Missouri en Madagascar, del inventario y la taxonomía a la conservación y el desarrollo basado en la comunidad. Con ustedes el doctor Lowry.
Buenas tardes. I apologize for speaking in English. I speak French fluently, and so I can understand Spanish quite well, but I have not yet mastered Spanish. I have a good teacher. Marcelo will teach me over the next year and a half. This is my first visit to Colombia. I am working on the genus Flora. I actually study Araliaceae around the world and have a grant now to study Flora in the Andean countries. And Marcela is working with my colleague Greg Plunkett and me as a postdoc. So she is introducing me to your beautiful country and the wonderful plants you have here and the wonderful plants you have in the herbarium here at the university, which has kept us busy for the last several days. I was hired by Missouri Botanical Garden in 1986, so more than 30 years ago, to coordinate our program in Madagascar. This is an island located off the coast of Africa, and as you see, it's about half the size of Colombia. It's the world's 4th largest island. And in many ways, Madagascar is like a small continent, as you will see. Madagascar was once part of Gondwana, attached to Africa and also to the Indian subcontinent. At about 130 million years ago, when flowering plants began to diversify, Madagascar separated from Africa. So you have Madagascar located here, and the separation with Africa is starting to open. At 80 million years ago, India separated from Madagascar and began to move north, and when India reached Asia, it created the Himalaya Mountains. So Madagascar has been an island separated from other continental areas for more than 80 million years. So the evolution of its plants and animals has largely happened isolated and not connected to other areas. Before I talk about plants, the fauna of Madagascar is very interesting. It is the only place in the world where lemurs occur. This is an important branch of primates that has evolved and diversified in Madagascar. The flora, so these are 2 species of lemurs here and here. The fauna of the amphibians and reptiles is also very diversified. In fact, 75% of chameleon species are found only on Madagascar. But as a botanist, I am most interested in the plants of Madagascar. This island has a large and diverse flora. One of its symbol plants is this member of the family Winteraceae, which is a primitive plant family, mostly in Australia, the Pacific, and New Guinea, with 1 species in the Africa region. The Missouri Botanical Garden became interested in working in Madagascar when Peter Raven came to direct our institution in the 1970s. Many of you may know this paper by Raven and Axelrod, which was the first paper ever to look at the relationship between plant distribution and plate tectonics. And Peter Raven identified several places in the world of particular botanical interest for our institution to study. One of them, of course, is the northern Andean countries, including Colombia, So we have a long relationship with Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, and Colombia, and also Central America. One of them is a place where I did my PhD work, New Caledonia, near Australia and New Zealand, in the Pacific Ocean. But another one is Madagascar. So it goes back almost 45 years to the beginning of our interest in Madagascar. As I said, Madagascar is like a small continent, and it has a great diversity of vegetation and habitat types. We have very humid forest, perhaps almost as humid as your Choco, 8 to 10 meters of rain per year. You have more in Choco, but this is per humid forest with very high rainfall, very high diversity. The mountains of Madagascar are not very tall. The tallest is about 2,600 meters. So compared to the Andes, these are very small mountains. But they have a very special flora on the top of each of these mountains. So we find endemism on mountain tops. We have a very dry vegetation filled with the analogs to Cactaceae. So there are Euphorbiaceae, the family Didieriaceae, which is found in Madagascar and Africa. And we have all kinds of transitions between dry and humid, low elevation, high elevation, which you know very well from Colombia because your country is full of ecological transition zones. Madagascar also has ecological transition zones. Our work in Madagascar began 30 years ago with exploration of areas that botanists had never visited. And you have many of those still in Colombia today. We are still in the phase of discovery in Madagascar, even after 150 years of botanical work and 30 years by Missouri Botanical Garden. This is a relatively small country, a big island, but the logistics are very difficult to get around. This is the main highway from the capital city to the north of the island. That gives you an idea how difficult it can be to reach field sites. Here in Colombia, this would be getting to a little village in a faraway place, but in Madagascar, this is the main highway from the north to the south of the country. Some statistics about the flora of Madagascar. When I began working in the country, we thought there were not quite 9,000 species of plants. Today, we know that there are about 14,000 species. And the difference has come from two things. First, botanical exploration and collecting in new areas. And second, taxonomic research using specimens from years ago and specimens collected now to describe new species. And you can see this is a very large increase in the number of plants known from Madagascar. Another characteristic of this flora, as is true for many countries with mountains, is there are many endemic plants. Many plants from only one or two mountains, one or two river valleys, one or two geographic areas. And this is very common in Madagascar. Microendemism characterizes the flora of Madagascar. I work on the family Aureliaceae. There are two main genera in Madagascar. The plants that used to be called Schefflera, but are now called Neocusonia. In fact, I will tell you now that in a few years, all of the plants you know from Colombia as Schefflera will have a different name. Because Schefflera is 5 separate clades in Aureliaceae, unrelated to each other. The clade in Madagascar is this one. The clade with the type species is, of course, the smallest, with only 8 species in the Pacific. In the neotropics, we have a large clade of about 400 species here, but they are not going to be called Schefflera. I can't tell you now if it's 1 or 2 or 3 genera. Marcella and I will answer this question in a few years, but I can tell you there are no Scheffleras in Colombia. I'm sorry. Madagascar has a large family of plants that is endemic to the island, Sarcolenaceae. This is a member of Malvales. There are 10 genera and 79 species in this family. To give you an idea, we revised each of these 10 genera starting in 1999. We went through one by one, and in each case we described new species, some from collections from historical collections and some from new collections. In 1999, we recognized 18 species, and 8 of them were new. And since 1999, we have described 4 more new species in this genus. This is an example of a flora where we are still in the phase of discovery and learning. Over the last 15 years, each of the taxonomic revisions we have done has resulted in an increase in the number of described species by more than 80%. And almost all of the newly described species are endemic to Madagascar. About 1/4 of these species were not even collected when we first started working in Madagascar. They were unknown in the herbarium, even from historical collections. Here you see 10 genera recently revised that give you examples of the increases. So first is a member of the olive family, Oleacea, which has gone from 41 to 87 species, and a genus in the orange family, Rutaceae, which has multiplied by a factor of 3, from 10 to 30. Here is Sarcolenaceae. We've gone from 33 to 72. That should be 79 species, not 72. This group has multiplied by a factor of 10, from 3 to 30 species. This one from 3 to 33, and this one from 1 to 10. Most groups we study, as soon as we begin taxonomic research, we find that there are many more species than have names. It makes it an interesting place to be a plant taxonomist. My colleague George Schatz and I began a few years ago to study the genus Diosporus, which produces ebony wood, black wood that is very important for making musical instruments. There are many species in Madagascar, and as you will see, our work has added many new species. My colleague George became interested in Diosporus. In 1989, he lived in Madagascar for 2 years, actually, and worked on a very small island of 500 hectares. And in one day, he collected all of these species of Diosporus in fruit. Diosporus is very important as a source of food for the primates in Madagascar, the lemur species. So there is a co-evolution between mammals and Diosporus that has driven the diversification of this genus. The Taxonomy of Diasporus was revised in 1952 by a French botanist, and he recognized about 100 species in Madagascar. When George and I studied the material examined by Perrier, we reduced this to 86 because there was some synonymy. But there was also a lot of specimens with no name, so we began looking at them. Today, we already can recognize another 155 new species. So we go from 100 to 240 species in Madagascar. And every time we receive new botanical collections from Madagascar, there is 1 or 2 new Diosporus each month or every 2 months. This is now the largest, most speciose genus of trees in Madagascar. One of the other things that we have developed in Madagascar is a project using Topicos, the Missouri Botanical Garden database, to deliver information about the flora. And we have now compiled information on all 1,700 genera and about 12,000 of the 14,000 species. So we provide taxonomic information, ecological information, but also information about the conservation status of species. Which species occur in national parks, which species do not occur in protected areas, which species are critically endangered or endangered. All of this is presented in the catalog along with photographs and maps that are generated to show the distribution of each species. So our program began with discovery and taxonomy, but also very early in Madagascar, we began intensive programs to train people in Madagascar. Because when I began working there, there were less than 5 botanists in the entire country. 3 at the university, 2 at the National Herbarium. That's all. For a big country like Madagascar, that is not enough botanists. So a priority for Missouri Botanical Garden was to train people in Madagascar to become the botanists of the next generation. And today, we have a large program, 150 employees of Missouri Botanical Garden in Madagascar. All of them are Malagasy, except 1 person from England. And many of our people we've trained now work for other institutions also. So we've put a strong emphasis in building national capacity to study the flora of Madagascar. Madagascar is a biodiversity hotspot. It meets 2 main criteria recognized for hotspots. It has high botanical diversity, high biodiversity, and also Madagascar's native habitats are very, very threatened. Almost 90% of the native vegetation is gone. Only 10% remains. And for some vegetation types, it's less than 1%. So the forest is disappearing very quickly, and it makes it a conservation priority. Madagascar is also the 4th poorest country in the world. The per capita income is very low. Most children do not go to school. There is no national health program. There is a very high population growth rate. When I went to Madagascar in 1986, the population was 10 million. Today, 24 million. And by 2050, 48 million. So from 10 million to 48 million. Very difficult to feed people in a country where the natural forest is decreasing and the population is increasing. We had a meeting of the staff of our Madagascar program about 15 years ago. And our Malagasy staff, our local staff, said, we are happy to be botanists. We are happy to do science. But we also want to be players in conserving the flora of our own country, not just having outside institutions do it. So we all agreed that we would begin a conservation component, a conservation action part of our program. And we started with an analysis to identify the priority areas for plant conservation. So the areas in red on this map were protected areas that existed in 2003. The areas in green are areas that were not protected, but that should be protected to conserve the plants of Madagascar. This is a gap analysis. We identified the areas that had to be added to the protected area system. About the same time, the president of Madagascar made a political decision that he announced in Durban, South Africa, at the World Parks Congress. He said, my government will increase the area for conservation 3 times. 3 times as much area for conservation. Today, this is the network of protected areas in Madagascar. And our study to identify the 77 new areas was very important in developing this new network of protected areas. So we have taken botanical information and analysis of plant distributions and provided recommendations to the government to increase the network of protected areas. At the same time, we realized that among the new areas we identified, some of them would not be of interest to the government or to the major conservation institutions like World Wildlife Fund or Conservation International. They were too small, they didn't have lemurs, they were in areas that were difficult to get to, very isolated. So we said, if they are going to be protected, we must protect them. So today, the Missouri Botanical Garden is working with the local communities to protect 12 new reserves in Madagascar. That were 12 places we identified as important for plants, and places that would have been lost, the biodiversity would have been lost if we had not become involved. So we use an approach, let me back up. At the beginning of my work in Madagascar, many organizations were trying to establish new integrated conservation and development projects. And the idea was to establish or protect a park or reserve by helping the local community. The idea is very good. I think that is the correct way to achieve conservation, certainly in Madagascar. But the problem is, like most projects that are funded from a government or the United Nations, you have money for 3 years, 4 years, 5 years maybe, and then the money is finished. You cannot change the way a community manages their land in 5 years. It's impossible. The only way to achieve conservation is to make a long-term commitment. It can take 20 or 30 years to bring about real change in a community. We have developed a different strategy for the 12 sites where Missouri Botanical Garden works. First, we have a staff member who lives in the community. So it's not a gringo arriving in a Toyota Land Cruiser for 3 days, giving money, giving some instructions, and going away. That does not work. It only works if you become a member of the community. And so our Malagasy staff live in the little poor villages that are next to or close to our conservation sites. We make a long-term commitment. We have said we will stay for 15 or 20 or 25 years, if necessary, to achieve changes and improvements in the community and to achieve conservation of the sites where we work. Every decision is made with the community. We don't tell the community what to do. We ask questions, we provide advice, but they make the decisions, and we help them implement the decisions. It's the only way to make this work. And we develop a shared vision of priorities. Of course, for poor campesinos, the priority is food, health, education, housing. So we have to help them address those needs. For us, the priority is conservation of the forest. So that means we have to ask the community to reduce their impact on the forest, to take less from the forest. If you do that, you must give them an alternative. If you take less wood from the forest, you must get wood from somewhere else to build your house or cook your food. We help them establish plantation forests, and our goal is to help them improve their quality of living while we also improve the quality of conservation of the forest. It's not easy, but it is possible. In Madagascar, when you are in a village far away from the capital city, the government is absent. There's no schools, no representatives of the Ministry of Environment or the Ministry of Interior. So the government can pass laws and regulations. They have no impact in rural Madagascar. But the traditional organization of communities in Madagascar has a set of rules or laws called Dina. And Dina are where a community agrees to do something together. And they agree themselves, if you don't follow the rules, what will your penalty be? What will your punishment be? So we use Dina to set up the rules for managing the protected areas. And we spend a lot of time educating and working with the young people in the community before they have developed the idea of how to raise their family and how to grow their crops. So we spend a lot of time teaching young children. So here are just a few photos. This happens all the time. Very, very regular community meetings to discuss. And for years, this has gone on. Our oldest site, now we have worked for 15 years. And we will probably work for another 10 or 15 years. We spend a lot of time teaching people how to grow crops. In Madagascar, people are not very, what's the word? People are very conservative. They grow the plants that their parents and grandparents grew. They don't grow new crops. They don't ask, give me something new that I can try to make my life better. So we have to first demonstrate and help them introduce this into their way of producing food. We focus a lot on teaching children, but we also help the local community with business enterprise. These baskets are produced in one of the villages where we work, and they are sold in stores in Missouri for a lot of money for Madagascar. We work with a non-profit organization. All of the money goes back to the local community. So we have connected a poor community in Madagascar to fancy grocery stores in St. Louis, and we generate money that goes back to the community. And it goes back to the community to make sure that the wetlands, where the cyperaceae that make these baskets grows, to make sure that it's conserved so they can continue to make baskets. We also do species level conservation. So the 12 sites I mentioned, we do community conservation for a whole protected area. But there are many species in Madagascar that are also very threatened. This is one species that we described in 1999 as part of our taxonomic study. And in fact, this species occurs in only 3 little remnant forest patches. In the high plateau of Madagascar, before it was all forest. But the forest has been cut. It's less than 1% of the forest left. And it looks like this. This is all non-natural grassland. It burns every year. It's introduced species, not native species. But you have little bits of native forest like this. Schizolina tampuketsana occurs in 3 forest patches. We looked in more than 100 forest patches, but only found it in 3 places. So we are now working with the local community to protect these forest patches. Here we are building fire breaks. So we cut the grass and burn so that when the annual fires come through, they just go around the forest. And in fact, this forest patch is expanding. If you don't burn it, then the forest will expand and become bigger. If you continue burning every year, it will get smaller. But we also have learned how to cultivate the plant. So now we have collected thousands of seeds. This plant is growing. We have put more trees back into the forest, but it is also growing now in front of the city hall at the nearby town. People now have this growing in their garden in the capital city. It's growing in the National Botanical Garden and at the National University. So even if the wild population goes extinct, we hope that won't happen, but it might, the species will not go extinct because we have done ex situ conservation. In situ conservation here and ex situ conservation here. And we are now doing this for more than 250 threatened plant species in Madagascar from different parts of the country. One of the components of our conservation activities involve collecting seeds and fruits of threatened plants, growing them, and including them in ecological restoration projects. So instead of just using fast-growing trees for ecological restoration, we also include threatened species to establish new populations. Here is an example of some of the ecological restoration we did. In 2010, we began this trial, and in 2014, the same place looked like this. And these are all done with native species, not fast-growing introduced species, but with endemic Malagasy species. And we include in the ecological restoration seedlings and seeds of threatened plants to ensure that they are protected in the wild. Madagascar is also a country with problems of illegal exploitation of the flora. It's a very poor country, so it's very tempting for people to take money to sell their natural resources to especially Asian countries, China in particular. And Madagascar produces rosewood from Dalbergia in the Fabaceae. In fact, more than $2.5 billion of rosewood was exported illegally from Madagascar over the last 8 years. Madagascar gets this much money. All of the profit goes to the mafia that organizes this and the people in China that use this wood. There are pictures on the internet. You can buy a beautiful bed, carved wooden bed made of this beautiful wood, and you can spend $1 million for a bed, one bed. But there are so many millionaires in China now who want to have furniture like the traditional Chinese furniture, which was all destroyed during the Cultural Revolution by Mao Zedong. All destroyed. So now wealthy people in China want this wood, and they're willing to pay incredible amounts of money. But this wood now only occurs inside protected areas, in parks and reserves. And these maps show areas where illegal wood cutting, illegal exploitation has happened inside national parks, which are UNESCO World Heritage Sites. So we have a battle going on, an economic battle for conservation, which of course is true everywhere. It's also true in Colombia. But Madagascar is a much poorer country than Colombia, so the temptation to sell the resources is much higher, and the ability of the government to control this is very weak. All of the cutting of wood in Madagascar is done by manual. There is no chainsaw in the entire country. Can you believe when people want to clear 1 hectare to grow rice to feed their family, they clear it like this. Not with a chainsaw. They cut down every tree. And for the Dalbergia, they cut it into pieces like this. The wood is very dense. If you put it on water, it sinks. So to float 1 log of rosewood, you must cut 10 logs of a tree with very light wood to float the Dalbergia. And the impact on the forest is very bad. This is inside a national park. People have come in, made a temporary camp to cut the trees. Here they are trapping lemurs to eat. So the primate population goes down. The forest gets gaps created in it. It's not a good situation. I was part of a team that produced a report about the precious hardwoods in Madagascar, and we made some recommendations for how to reduce the pressure, but more importantly, to develop economically sustainable use of precious woods in Madagascar, so that the money goes back to the village and goes back to the parks, rather than into the pockets of the mafia and the Chinese traders. So in 30 years of work in Madagascar, the Missouri Botanical Gardens program, which began doing botany, just botany, plant collecting, plant identification, plant taxonomy. And that is my training, and all of my colleagues were trained the same way. But our program has evolved because the needs of Madagascar are great, and the capacity in Madagascar was very limited. And today, we continue to do botanical research and discovery, but we are also directly involved in helping communities conserve at least part of the plants and animals of Madagascar. I think it's interesting to think that a botanical garden can be involved in community development and helping people to improve the way they live their lives. It's not a normal role for an academic institution or a research institution. It's not typical for us. But in Madagascar, the only way to achieve conservation is through community development. We cannot build a fence around a protected area and tell poor people, no, you can't go to the forest to take resources. That is not ethical, it's not moral, and it's not politically acceptable. The only way to do it is to work with the community, and that's what we're doing. We now have 12 protected sites with incredibly interesting plants in them. And now we can study them, but we don't have to study them quickly. We can now take time because the forest is protected. So I hope this has been interesting for you. I hope that you will perhaps think about how scientists, botanists, can become more directly involved in achieving conservation in your own country. We are doing this because our Malagasy staff said they wanted to do it. It's their choice. And I think it's a good example of how scientists can play a more active role than just doing our science. We have a biodiversity crisis everywhere in our planet, including in Colombia. And I think every one of us has to play a role in addressing this through our science and our studies, but also through our actions. And we are trying to do that through our program in Madagascar. Thank you. If you have questions, I will be happy to try to answer. Yes?
Okay, first of all, thank you so much for coming to our country. I would like to know if you have found any new species of orchids in Madagascar.
Yes, lots and lots of species of orchids.
Endemic species?
All of them are endemic. Or 95 to 98% of orchids are endemic to Madagascar. We estimate there are about 1,000 orchid species. That is small compared to Colombia, but it's still a lot of species in a small island. One of my colleagues who works in my program, Tariq Stevard, has developed a technique to do orchid inventory work. When you go into the forest, usually most epiphytic orchids are sterile. So no flowers, no fruits, you can't identify them. What we do is we collect all of the sterile plants and we grow them in a shade house. And we track them through flowering and fruiting. We take photographs, specimens, DNA samples, and we can describe all of the new species. We've discovered more than 200 new species of orchid in Madagascar, and there are many more to be described. Yes?
Do you know Madagascar a huge program about vanilla?
Yeah.
Yeah. I saw it in the newspaper, the best vanilla around the world.
So,
Still you are working in this?
So, in Madagascar, the cultivated vanilla is a very major and important crop species. And it's true, some of the best vanilla I showed you the area with the perihumid climate, with the high rainfall, and the island where George Schatz worked. That is the vanilla growing area of Madagascar, and the vanilla is really, really good quality. So in Madagascar, the local farmers don't get paid very much.
Who get the profits?
The middlemen. Of course, like everywhere in the world, the producers don't get very much. But when I buy Malagasy vanilla in France, it's €5 for one bean. Yeah. In Madagascar, you can get 100 for €2. And it's really good vanilla. But in addition to the cultivated vanilla, there are many native species of vanilla. The genus vanilla is present in Madagascar. And there are about 20 species of native vanilla. Of course, the cultivated vanilla comes from the New World. Yes?
You mentioned that in the hills of Madagascar grew some interesting species that are very different from the ones found in the lower areas.
Mm-hmm.
Could you describe some of them?
Sure. So the Madagascar, the north-south part of Madagascar, it sits in the area where we have the wind with the humidity coming from the east. So the east coast of Madagascar is very wet. The west coast of Madagascar is very dry. The rain goes up the mountains, drops rain, and then it becomes more dry as you go across. So on the east coast, you find typical just like you do here, humid rainforest. On the high plateau, you have forest where there is more of a seasonal climate. So rainfall during December, January, February, March, and the rest of the year, not so much rainfall. And so we have in the same genus, we will have species that are rainforest species, species that are on the high plateau in the seasonal forest, and species in the dry forest in the east, which are deciduous. They lose their leaves each year. Yes?
It is incredible how you can sustain such a program for so long, and I was wondering what is it in terms of proportion of the economical effort to sustain the program, how it works in terms of how much Madagascar has been interested in it, putting money on it, or if it's more an international effort to this program.
It's mostly international, but it works at two levels. Well, first, I should say, in 1983, we signed a convenio with the government of Madagascar. Our program is recognized in the same way as the Red Cross, like an international NGO that is in Madagascar to help Madagascar. So we have lots of freedom to do research and to train people, but we also have responsibilities to help Madagascar and to contribute to improving science, technology, and conservation and development in Madagascar. Initially, when I began working, all of the funding came from the United States, some from United Nations, and these kinds of organizations. But now, there are many organizations that prefer, donor organizations, that prefer to give money and identify projects inside Madagascar. And our Malagasy staff, these people here, write grant proposals and manage projects and get money themselves. So now we have money coming from outside of Madagascar, and money that the grants are awarded inside the country. The money comes from outside. Madagascar is too poor a country. The government cannot give money to support science and conservation. But many donors now operate inside the country. And so we benefit from both of these to have our program be financially sustainable.
Oh.
Yeah.
Too many questions.
No, there's never such thing as too many
Many
questions.
families are endemic from Madagascar. That's one question.
Yeah.
Other question, you are talking about a huge, amazing diversity, in this case of plants, this huge, amazing biodiversity has a strong relationship with the habitat. Do you have any map about the habitat?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. The answer to the question is yes.
How many families?
Oh, sure. So the endemism is
above in family.
It's about there is family level endemism. There's high level generic endemism, almost 20% of the genera, and then almost 90% of the species. So there's a battle between Hawaii and Madagascar for highest endemism in the world. Hawaii is 89%, we know. Madagascar is 88, 89, maybe 90, but we're still discovering. In terms of ecogeography, in fact, one of the reasons that we are able to do better taxonomy today than Perrier de la Bâtie in 1952 when he first worked on diasporas is because we now understand more about the geology and the soils and the climate of Madagascar. And there is a very strong correlation between the distribution of plant species and the soil type. So you will find two species that look very similar. One that grows on sandstone and quartzite, and another one that might grow on granite and gneiss. And when you are doing your taxonomy, you put them together and you say, oh, they look alike. Oh, but these are on sandstone in the north, and these are on granite in the south. They can't be the same thing. You look again, you find a character, it's two species. So we now have a much better understanding of the ecogeography, the climates, the vegetation, and the substrate in Madagascar. And it's very informative for taxonomy. It's a very powerful tool. And it enables us to see differences in species that people before would not see.
Is there an interaction between the people in charge of the protected areas outside your area of influence? Like, do you communicate with them? Are they learning from your experience?
We do. So one of the interesting things that happened when the president of Madagascar decided to increase the area by 3, they realized that it would not be possible for the government institution that manages parks and reserves to manage 3 times as much area. They couldn't even manage the protected areas that already existed. So the government asked IUCN to help them look at all of the different kinds of protection. And there are many kinds. Community-based conservation like we do, private reserves, public-private partnerships, many models. And they selected 7 different models that they thought would possibly work in Madagascar. So now there are different kinds of conservation going on. Some are more successful than others. It's a big experiment. In truth, there is an experiment going on to determine which model or models is going to have the best effect on conserving the flora and fauna of Madagascar. We communicate a lot with some of those groups and less with others. The big national parks run by the National Park Service, they still have the mentality from the colonial period. They are all still officially associated with the military. Not with guns, but their mindset is the hierarchy of a military, the boss and the next man down and the next man down in a hierarchy. This community-based work we do is not hierarchical. It's a very different model of how to bring about change. So we communicate less with them. We interact with them because we do botanical inventory work in national parks. And they use the information we generate, but they have not yet adopted our methods of community engagement. But there are other NGOs in conservation and even some in development. In fact, the biggest thing that's going to happen, I think, in the next 5 years, we're a group of people doing conservation. Conservation International, Missouri Botanical Garden, Wildlife Conservation Society. Over here are the big development organizations. You have CARE and Doctors Without Borders. They have 10 times as much activity and 10 times as much money as we do. But they are currently only doing development, education, food, health, nothing about biodiversity. What we want to do is to infiltrate them and get them to think, to realize, because it's true, you can spend all the money you want on health and education, but if the natural resources around the community are lost, your investment is lost. So we want to infiltrate the development community and get them to think a little bigger, not just about the people, but about the environment and the landscape that the people live in, so that they will also help protect the biodiversity and the natural areas that give water and medicinal plants and food and shelter, so that their investment in strict development can be improved. And that's the challenge that we've set for ourselves for the next 5 years, to continue being successful, but to infiltrate and influence and change the way the development community thinks. If we can do that, then our ability to improve the situation in Madagascar goes up like this. Because we can't do it all ourselves, but they can, because they are everywhere in Madagascar. Yes?
I have just a comment because you mentioned Bursedaceae, and I just wanted to share that I know that the several species of canarium have co-evolved with the lemurs.
Yes.
And one example is that the canarium pairing is really hard,
Yep.
but they have a little hole, and then lemurs have developed a longer middle finger to
That's
reach
right.
to
That's
go
right.
through the hole and open the seed. So it's
That's-
a very interesting
That's
case.
one particular lemur species. It's called the ii, Dobentonia
Oh, the ii.
madagascariensis.
Yes, yes, yes.
I will just add one quick comment to show you how taxonomy works in Madagascar. The previous taxonomy of canarium recognized 3 species. But we knew there were more than that, because when you go to a village in Madagascar and you talk about canarium, rami, to the local community, they say, oh, there's one that has fruits in February, and one that has fruits in June, and one that has fruits in October. And why do they know it? Because the lemurs go to eat the food, and they go to trap the lemur. So the local people already had a better taxonomy than we did. So we now go, 2 of my colleagues, Doug Daly from New York, and one of our staff members in Madagascar, they have now revised canarium from 3 to 33 species. And they would go to the village and ask the local people, show me the 3 different rami in your village. And then they would collect them. And the taxonomy improved. It's the lemurs that were telling us that there are different species.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much.